enjoyed it so far this morning? I didn't hear that. We need to say it louder for the camera at the back. Have you enjoyed it so far this morning? Yes. That's better. Good. Right, you've got a lot to live up to, panel. You realise that? There's a lot of rich content this morning. So I'm going to very briefly introduce the people on the panel and then ask them to say a bit more about themselves, give them a chance to do a 2-3 minute pitch on where they're coming from. But then I'll open it up to the floor and ask for people to give us some questions and to grill this particular group of people who have an awful lot to offer in terms of how we work in the sort of ethics and privacy space. So, just running down the line, on my immediate right, we have Jessica Montgomery from the Royal Society. We have Luciano, who you've already met from this morning, from the Oxford Internet Institute. We have Sue Gates from the Cabinet Office, and then on the far side we have, Sue Daly from the Cabinet Office, and on the far side we have Sue Daly from Tech. Thank you. Tech UK.
Yeah,
and
Sarah
Gates from the Cabinet Office on the far end. See, I told you should have filled out your nameplates on the front. It would have helped.
About how they're handling data there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that would...
Sorry, that probably would have helped.
Yeah. Okay, Jessica, if I could ask you just to introduce yourself and tell us what your brief view is on ethics.
Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Jess Montgomery and I work at the Royal Society, which is the UK's National Academy of Sciences, where I look after a programme of work on data and digital technologies. And over the last 2 years, we've run 3 major projects in this space. Our cybersecurity work looked at the way we can create trustworthy and resilient systems. Our machine learning project looked at how we can help realise the potential of this technology in the UK. And our current project on the governance of data and its uses, which Luciano is contributing to as a working group member, is looking at the data governance needs of the 21st century. And what we found across these projects is new technology has a huge amount it can offer us in improving our health, wealth and well-being. In healthcare, we're already seeing machine learning be put to use in providing more accurate diagnoses. In transport, not only is it supporting autonomous vehicles, it's also helping analyse congestion patterns, reducing carbon emissions, and it has potential across a range of businesses to support economic growth and productivity. Now, as we put these technologies to use, they use data in new ways or ways we've not experienced before. This both reframes some of our existing ideas about data ethics or data governance, for example, challenging current notions of privacy or consent, and it also creates new tensions in the governance environment. So what are these new questions for our governance systems? Well, the Society is looking at that through our Governance of Data and Its Uses project, and we're investigating how we can ensure we can support the safe and rapid delivery of the benefits from these new technologies, whilst ensuring public confidence in their use and making sure the benefits of them are broadly shared. Public confidence is key in this, so we've also been supporting a major programme of public engagement. So our baseline is that there are huge opportunities in data and in new digital technologies, and now is a really important time to begin to shape how we want these technologies to develop and to negotiate some of the new challenges that arise as they develop. So I'll leave it there for the time being and hand over to Luciano.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. Luciano.
Yes, I've been told to be brief because I've already spoken a lot before lunch. Luciano Floridi, I am a very long title, the Oxford Internet Institute Professor of Philosophy and Ethics of Information. They couldn't get that right. Essentially I work on the conceptual foundations of our information society. Epistemology, ethics, philosophy of science, logic, but also political philosophy and everything else you can put in the basket of philosophy when it comes to problems that are of a conceptual nature, that are under the surface. Which means, and I close here, that normally we work in the dark and with our hands dirty. It's like gardening, you look at the roots. You don't enjoy the flowers, that's philosophy for you. And if you think that those roots are not relevant because you enjoy only the flowers, remember the flowers will not bloom unless the roots are taken care of. And that's what we do. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm Sue Daly. I'm head of cloud computing, big data, data analytics, and artificial intelligence at Tech UK. Tech UK, we are the voice of the technology sector. We are a trade association. We represent over 950 UK technology companies, 2/3 of which are SMEs. but we cover and represent the whole of the digital ecosystem in the UK. And I'd say thank you for the organisers of the event and organising this panel, because this is a really vital issue and vital topic that Tech UK is doing a lot of thinking on at the moment, as others are. And as Jessica said, why is this really important, and why is this necessary to have these discussions? Because we know advances in big data, data analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence is raising questions that we need to be thinking about in terms of moving forward. Questions around data use, questions around responsibility, transparency, accountability, and even ownership. There is an ethical debate which is being driven by the increased use of data-driven algorithms and algorithmic decision-making that means that ethical issues and questions are being raised, and not just raised by industry, but raised by individuals and society as well. There are many questions about what this future really means and what it will mean to all of us and where we're going moving forward. I have to say I've been to a lot of events this year, and whether it's talking about big data, data analytics, or artificial intelligence, machine learning, ethics is always raised, and ethics comes up. But you know, what does it really mean? What, you know, people are talking about it, but do we really understand what it means? And this is really important because it's not something in the future. These issues need to be, you know, considered now. This is already with us right now, and industry is being asked for some of those answers to those questions and some clarity, and it is really important that we come together, not just as industry, but as academia, as the research society, the society as a whole, and government, to think about how we consider some of these questions and these issues that are being raised. Particularly because I think we need a balanced and open debate and discussion about where technology is moving. You know, think about this in a practical sense, but also look at the opportunities as well as the challenges and how we can address some of these challenges. But this is not something that industry can do on its own. This is not something that industry is going to be able to solve. It's not something I would say government or even academia is going to solve on its own. We all need to work together and finding ways to do that and to have the discussions that we need to have in light of where we're moving going forward. And more importantly, and on my final point, is how we do this in a way that we bring everybody on this journey with us. How do we build that culture of trust and confidence around data and data use? That means that everybody in society, across all sections of society, can benefit from better use and use of data moving forward. I think that's really a key point to discuss today.
Thank you, Sue. Sarah.
I'm Sarah Gates. I'm a policy advisor in the strategy and engagement team at Government Digital Service. I also worked for a short time with Jess at the Royal Society on the Data Governance Project. So within the strategy and engagement team, I sit in a team that's now called Data Governance, which is a small team. We used to call ourselves Data Ethics, but we found that that was quite a loaded term and wasn't very useful because people expected us to make ad hoc ethical decisions on what they should do. So part of my work in the data governance team is helping to put together another version of, the second version of the data science ethical framework. So the first data science ethical framework was published in May 2016 by some people who have now left GDS but were also in my team. So I'm not sure how many people are aware of the ethical framework, and that will actually be part of my work going forward in producing the next version, but it essentially sets out kind of 6 high-level principles and things to think about when carrying out a data science project in government. It's a very useful document in terms of actually beginning the conversation about data science. So it's not just for data scientists, although the title could be off-putting, but it would certainly be something very useful for anyone who's interested in data science, whether it's policy, academia from a different angle, or just the general public, because it gives a really nice overview and different case studies of the kinds of things that people do in government. And in other places, it also includes external to government examples. So part of my work going forward with the second version is to really think about how can we get people using the ethical framework without it becoming a barrier. And how can we actually raise the profile of it with data scientists within government? Because from my own kind of anecdotal experience, there's not a huge amount of visibility for the framework currently. And the ways I'm thinking about doing this, and actually it would be really interesting to talk about some of these things today, I'm thinking about actually embedding sort of technical processes that help people be ethical. So we have a growing number of data scientists now at GDS, which is really great because it means we can go and have conversations with data scientists, because I am not one. Although I come from a physical science background, I'm not a data scientist. But we can talk about things that will really help them use the framework as an enabler and do the right thing and think about the processes. So there's ongoing work around reproducible analytical pipelines that one of our data scientists is carrying out. And this is just about documenting your work properly, making it reproducible, which seems like a very basic thing, but if you can't make something reproducible, you're probably not behaving ethically. Some of the other things that we want to develop are kind of a more technical deep dive into algorithmic accountability. So we're working closely with a student at the Information School in Sheffield to look at actual technical developments that have happened, mainly within the past couple of years, around algorithmic fairness and transparency. So not necessarily looking into what the algorithm is doing, but looking at your input data and your output data and sort of retroactively deciding what attributes have been important in this, and what, not only what attributes, but what proxy attributes, so that we can really think about what biases we might be getting in an algorithm. And these are the kinds of things that we really want to work on further throughout the whole data science community and policy professionals through government, to sort of, maybe the first version was perhaps a sort of a high level look at the issues, whereas now we want to kind of get into the technicalities and how can we really help people be ethical. There's also, sort of based on the kind of talk that Luciano gave on the rights explanation, this is also a very interesting thing for us, because obviously the tools that help us be transparent and accountable will also perhaps, maybe if the GDPR doesn't go far enough, but maybe we want to go further and actually give people answers on how decisions are made. And that was definitely inspired by the right to explanation from GDPR. So other things that we do in the team include the open data strategies. There's obviously some interesting questions around how open data could potentially be used to tackle some of these issues, encouraging companies to actually publish statistics, aggregate statistics on their decision making. So hopefully we can talk about some of these things today. Thank you. Okay,
thank you, Sarah. Without wanting to put you on the spot, could you possibly just reel off the 6 principles of the ethical framework?
I could...
Shall I give you a moment?
I can't reel them off. Okay. The first, okay, I can't say the kind of in the order, but there's be alert to public perceptions, make things open, have robust data science models, be accountable, and make sure things are secure. So those are the kind of not the word for word principles. But was that 6?
That's 5.
5. It's make sure you're doing your project for public good.
Yeah,
so try
be
and
brave as well, isn't there? There's some kind of.
No, I think that's a separate GDS slogan. But be bold. So the public perceptions and the kind of define the public good of your project. Those are the 2 most contentious principles, because really obviously they're very subjective.
The context of where you're working. Okay, I can't. I pick up on what Ruth said earlier. It is very dark, the room from here, when you're standing up here with the lights going in your face. If you do have any questions that you're sparked into from the comments that are going there, I will take them from the floor. We already have one. I'll also then break in a moment and give the chance to the panel to reflect on what they've heard from the other people as well, if they want to come in on there. If you want to say who you are, where you're from, and if your question is aimed at anyone in particular.
Okay, so I'm Howard Davies from Context World, and just for the panel in general. As social media gets accelerated in all sorts of different ways, not just Facebook and Google, but everywhere else, to what extent do you feel, because those companies have to make decisions about privacy and the practical day-to-day work that they conduct, and so every day they're making those decisions, and as Luciano said, issues come up when new technology creates the conditions that require decisions to be made, not outside of that. So they're facing those real decisions all the time. To what extent do you feel that the work you do is always somehow on the back foot of all of that leading edge technology that's happening, where the companies are just putting things in place?
So are we on the back foot compared to companies utilising, using, abusing, our data?
So I can kick it off. So you raised an interesting question, because as we all know, that the pace of technology change is faster than I've ever seen it before. And technology is evolving very quickly, and it's important that the legislative and regulatory requirements and framework around data protection and data privacy issues are able to respond as technology evolves. And this is why, particularly from a Tech UK and an industry point of view, we always strive to make sure that legislation and regulatory requirements that come in are technology neutral. Because we may not know what the future technologies will be in the next 20 years. Now, if you look at the GDPR is obviously coming in next year or coming into force. But if you look at what we have today, we have the Data Protection Act in the UK, which comes from the Data Protection Directive 95/46, and that was first written back in 1995, implemented in the UK in 1998. Now, it talks in the day of filing cabinets and data files. But I would argue that it actually has, as a flexible, principle-based framework, legal framework, it has stood the test of time. It needs to be updated, which is why we now have GDPR. But if you think about the technology, and not just social media, but all the technologies that we live and breathe on a day-to-day basis, have evolved within that legal framework. Now, is it perfect? No. Does it need to be updated? Yes, which is now why we have GDPR. We will have to see if GDPR can keep pace with technology change. And only time will tell, I think, on that. But it provides a harmonized legal framework and regulatory framework that allows technology to evolve, I believe, as we move forward. Now, will it last another 20 years? That's probably another discussion, and maybe we could do a whole panel on that. But I do think it gives companies the framework to work within, and from a legal point of view, to be able to answer questions as and when they come up in terms of what they should and shouldn't be doing.
Anyone else? Luciano? Yeah.
2 points. The first one is only half a point because of an agreement for non-disclosure. But those companies, normally they ask advice. And so to that question, do you feel behind? No, unfortunately, I feel in charge. And so if they make a mistake, sometimes it's because you gave them the wrong advice. So that is as much as I can say on that front about a very, very popular social media. But the other point that I wanted to make, which is a bit less cryptic, is we should really get the analogy with speed right. And I agree. I mean, the technology is going really fast. Innovation is amazing. You open the newspaper, and there's something new every day. And that is not about what we need to decide in this room, for example. Because any vector or any car has a speed and a direction. And politics and governance is about direction. It's not about speed. So the faster we go, the better we should be driving. It's not the faster we go, the more hands off. No, that's insane. So when I hear anyone, and normally they have an agenda, saying, oh, it's too fast, or you can't regulate it. No, it's exactly the opposite. Precisely because we're going so fast. We better go fast in the right direction than we as a society decide. So more societal involvement, more discussions like the ones we're having with this kind of sort of stakeholders are very welcome. And they're not going to undermine innovation. They're going to give innovation a sense of direction. Otherwise, innovation could go in any possible 360 degrees particular direction. So if we like where we're going, we should be going there even faster.
And then just building on Luciano's point, yes, there is uncertainty generated by this lag between practice and the law. At the Society, we've been talking about governance in the round rather than the law solely as a governance instrument. So this is about codes of practice, institutional behaviours, norms, as well as legal instruments. And what we're looking at, in the vein that Luciano just said, is a way of navigating that uncertainty in a principled way that allows us to move forward with the technology safely and rapidly, realising those benefits. And I'm going to trail then our report on governance of data and its uses, which will be out at the end of June, and we'll talk a bit more about how we're going to navigate those challenges.
Okay, Sarah, did you want to come in on there or no?
Yeah, just to quickly say, I think obviously technology is moving very quickly, but I think we should look at it quite positively. people might think, oh, it causes us all these problems and these things we have to figure out sort of around ethics and decision making. But I mean, at the end of the day, the technology moving quickly is also going to be how we get to the answers quickly, and sort of increasing the visibility of these things to the public is really the biggest challenge for me, I think, at the minute, because increasing the visibility will increase the demand for companies, all private companies, including social media companies, to do things better and to give more control, perhaps, if we want it. And that will mean we innovate and actually get to a better place more quickly, hopefully.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got a question that was submitted in the box outside. Does the panel think that a digital doppelganger of a person is that person's property? And to what extent do they think that misrepresentations of a person in their digital self could be seen as libel or slander in the future? So who owns my data?
Don't look at the philosopher. I'm
Sorry.
not going to go first. Ladies first.
Okay, so do you want to go?
No, you can go first.
Oh, thanks. So it's a fascinating question, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't think I'm able to the answer to slander one. But it does raise an interesting question, which we know is being discussed more and more around data ownership. And I think we have to be really clear as to what data ownership means, because depending on what audience you're talking to or what meeting you're at, the people around the table or the people in the room will have a different understanding about what data ownership means to them. It means different things to different people. And in a legal context, it will mean very different things to different people as well. I think what's important for me in this debate and this discussion around data ownership, which is, again, is one we need to have, and we need to have a discussion around it because of the questions like this that are being raised, is not so much to try and get into the kind of what does it mean and let's have a kind of a couple of years tossing around the idea, and can we introduce a kind of data ownership rule or law or something in law, which we don't believe you can do because it's not the same as owning property. But what is important is making sure that the tools, the technologies, the mechanisms are in place so that people can make real decisions and real-time decisions about how their data is being used and when their data is being used, and that they have the control to make those decisions. And that to follow up Sarah's point, I think technology will play a really important role there, and technology innovation will play a really important role to develop those mechanisms that allow people to do that. I think that's where we would like to see the data ownership debate and discussion going, so that the tools and technologies and the mechanisms are in our hands to make the decisions about how our data is being used.
But don't you see there's a bit of a problem there with, if we're this far advanced in terms of having to deal with all of these issues around privacy and data ownership, but we can't yet agree about what data ownership actually means?
So I think it's because it means different things to different people. I don't know if and I don't know what the other panelists feel, but whether we will ever get a definitive, this is what data ownership means. So in the meantime, what's important is making sure that those mechanisms and those tools are there to allow people to make decisions and to deal with how their data is being used right now. And I think GDPR will help with that. I think GDPR will be an important tool to help with that. But I think it will also, and debates and discussions like this will drive people to innovate and drive people to come up with innovative solutions to address some of these issues, which are quite new to people.
Sarah?
I always find data ownership kind of unhelpful thing to focus on, because I don't think that anyone can answer that question, so I'm not going to try. I think it raises the gaps. That question raises the gaps in current legislation. It's perhaps something we can never legislate for, but it's sort of the grey area. It may not necessarily be your own personal data, as in data about you, but it could be, as you say, a digital doppelganger that could be used to make decisions that affect your life. And I don't know if there's an easy way. I don't think there's an easy answer to how we control that, but it should be about how we govern data itself is more about how we want society to work. So if we want to be treated well, that's the same as how we want what people should do with data shouldn't mistreat or discriminate against other people. So these issues aren't necessarily about ownership, but how people behave.
And that's not just in the digital world, that's the real world as well.
Yeah.
Luciano?
Just to add to what has already been said, with which I agree very much. When we talk about personal identity, a classic distinction really looks at basically three things. There are many others, but it's who you are, who you think you are, and who society thinks you are. And those three things, normally in a healthy human being, they overlap to a good extent. In unhealthy context, who you are and who you think you are, there you go, and you think you're Napoleon. But in this particular context, there's the trouble of society thinking who you are and making that operational. In other words, what the digital has transformed, there was always a moment when society thought you were, I was, etc. Not in a small village in the middle of Italy, etc. A century ago, of course, but it was not that operational. Whereas now, what society thinks you are, it translates almost immediately into decisions, operations, targeting, potential great services, the good piece of advertisement. Finally, I can see that is exactly the pair of shoes I wanted to buy, or discrimination, bias, etc. But that translation, that the digital has made that third entity way more weighty and valuable and sort of kind of delicate than it was in the past. And that's where I think having control on who society thinks you are, in other words, your, say, photocopy, doppelganger, your profile in other contexts is crucial. Because without that control, then that social self, so to speak, of you may sort of backfire. Or it may not give you all the advantages that would have been there in the first place. So there's a sort of opportunity cost. So if you build that thing positively, control means getting the best out of that social self, which now is operational.
There's a follow-up question that was also submitted, which is related to that and touches on the point that we've used the words ethics as well. So do different communities and societies have different understanding of what is ethical?
My turn, right?
Your turn.
Yeah, I knew it. I knew that it would come. You're going to get the classic philosophical answer, yes and no. Because think about friendship. Do we really think that in different contexts, different times, different societies, friendship didn't exist? Or no, of course not. Of course, friendship is friendship. Then you start thinking, oh, well, wait a moment. Friendship in Athens, 5th century, between a man and a boy, well, just expected. And it was of an erotic kind. And it was perfectly fine. Today, in this society, that would be something you go to jail for. So that friendship had a different meaning. So again, what is the ethics here? I think there's a level at which we do have pretty much the same understanding, and after all, we are all almost sapiens on this planet, so enough of this on the one end, on the other hand, relativistic this and relativistic that, how many words does it take to say snow is white, etc. But at the same time, we should not underestimate the nuances, the sort of delicacy of that embedded values there, culture. I think the best corporate agents I know, and the best firms in the world, which have to have that kind of global understanding of values, they manage to move in the right direction in a very narrow space between local interpretation and universal sort of, imagine UN Chart of Human Rights. It's not a big space, but there is a space in between. So anything that goes into the opposite direction seems to me misleading. And that is the world in which we're going to live increasingly, inevitably.
Jessica.
So we have some insights into this question from the public dialogue exercise that we ran last year on machine learning. And we had a range of different types of discussion in that dialogue, which was with a representative group of the public from across the UK. We talked about the technology in general terms, explaining what machine learning is, talking about how it worked. We talked about ethics and governance in general terms, talking about what type of oversight people might want. And we talked about how the technology was being used in practice. And what we found over those three different types of discussions is what really got people interested was context. Why is this being developed? Who is it being developed by? For what purpose? Who is going to benefit? So really we began to focus less on the questions of what are ethics? Do we share the same ethics? And more about the context, and context being key to the development of machine learning, and how that context specificity then begins to relate to the type of ethical discussions you have as a sort of second question. So that's a different type of approach than talking about data ethics in the round, which I think is relevant here.
Okay, go on.
Very quickly, there's another aspect to this as well, and I agree in terms of what ethics means in this debate, and around data will evolve as our thinking evolves. But there's also, given the opportunities that data and data-driven economy and society can provide, healthcare being a great opportunity, but in others, there is also the question of whether, to what extent companies and organisations have an ethical responsibility to innovate. Because there is so much potential here, there is so much good that data-driven technologies and data-driven solutions can provide. That ethical responsibility to move forward is also, I think, an interesting aspect of this debate as well.
Okay, any more from the floor? Yes, in the middle, and the mics are coming in. Thank you.
I'm William from DWP, Department for Work and Pensions. In your opinion, where does the responsibility for posts and videos on social media lie in terms of if they're illegal or unethical? Does it lie with the users or with the owners of the platform, and to what extent? Because I know, for example, in Germany, there's a law coming in, I think, to fine the owners of social media platforms for the number of days illegal or, so for example, a terrorist-related content is on their site, that kind of thing.
So who owns the responsibility, the poster or the...
So very quickly, you raise, and I don't want to talk about specifics, but you raise two things in your question, whether it's ethical or whether it's legal. And I would say that companies have a responsibility to work within the legal framework that is in place and to make responsibilities based on that legal framework and their legal requirements.
And sometimes they also have a duty to challenge that framework if they think that that's the wrong framework. But that's not a company that you normally have doing business. But imagine you're a company in South Africa doing apartheid. Then you want to have that company challenging the law. So there are laws and laws. We have to remember that historically the law is not always right. That's why we have ethics, now, to put the law on the right path. But no, that is in complete agreement. I mean, your ordinary company will comply, and that's the next step. In terms of your question, who is responsible? I would like to have the logic or, which means and or, is inclusive or, as in male and female. No, men or women can apply, that kind of or, because the users and the builders of this space have mutual responsibilities. The analogy here would be with a public park. Whoever builds and maintains that park has responsibilities, but don't tell me that anyone around there doesn't have responsibility of keeping it clean. So it's a bit of a misleading point to say, oh, one or the other, because it's really both. We're all on that park together. But we need to remember that that park is no longer owned or built by society. It's owned and built by the corporate world, whether we like it or not at the moment. And therefore, it's the corporate world that has to have the responsibility to make a good business. It's the architecture within which we are living. So with that comes a lot of responsibility, seems to me, ethically speaking.
Okay, any more from the floor? Ruth?
Charlene? I think this links back a little bit to Luciano's original framework that went from feasibility to legality to ethics. And a bit linking to the fact that what people believe is ethical will depend on context. And the thing that you didn't mention, Luciano, possibly deliberately, is that there's also effectiveness. So if we take the example of a complete surveillance society, where the police have access to everybody's, or the MI5 or whoever has access to everybody's communications. That's feasible. It could be made legal. And if there's enough outcry and concern whipped up about terrorism, then it could get acceptance ethically. But whether it would help for the haystack to be made bigger for the security services to try to find the needles is yet another question. Would the panel like to comment on that link between feasibility, ethics, effectiveness, and legality?
Go for it.
So I just start by saying one thing we haven't mentioned so far yet is that the technology is moving all the time with respect to how it relates to these ethical issues. So we're already seeing new approaches in machine learning to address challenges relating to interpretability and to resolve the trade-off that currently exists in some applications between accuracy and transparency. So there may well be new technological solutions to these ethical challenges, as well as the technology raising further ethical challenges. And there's a really exciting research agenda in machine learning at the moment relating to fairness, transparency, and accountability, and addressing some of these questions about feasibility.
Yeah, I won't comment on security services, but GDS is an advocate of being open and transparent and giving people more control. So I think for any context, if we're going to increase sort of the use of data, especially personal data, like we've seen in health space recently, I think it's important that we bring people along, and we should have to explain to people what the benefits of doing it are, because quite often we can do some data science, whether it's in private sector or in government, and there's a gap between the thing we find out, which might be very exciting, and then what we actually make it into, and is it actually a long-lasting, beneficial policy or product? There might be a slight gap between that at the minute, and also communicating that to people. So I think there's definitely a lot of work to do around actually showing people the benefits, because as a few people have already mentioned here, it's definitely context dependent on how people will accept these new technologies.
So there's, working from a government perspective, there's a real reputational risk for how we handle and control data about the individual, be it for security purposes or be it health data or welfare data or tax data. And there is something that we have to do about how we convince the public that collecting lots of information about the individual, which is a necessary part of government processes, actually adds value to the whole in terms of delivering a better quality service. But what more do you think that government as a key player in this can do to boost its reputation? Because it nearly lost the health data argument in terms of reputational risk of individuals. In the tax and welfare space, it just collects that information anyway, but you know, we've all heard stories in the past of CDs and laptops left on trains and then the reputation goes down. So what more could government do?
So there's a few things. With the health case, I think people were just very confused about what the objective was. And I think that's not good enough. We need to be explaining to people why we're doing these things, because we can't expect people to go along with things if we can't even be clear about what we're trying to achieve. So I think in anything with going forward, government needs to be really clear on what it's trying to do. But there's also a lot of confusion around the kind of the increasing use of data, because we haven't suddenly started using data, and it's been going on for a very long time. And I think where these conversations become very confused in the public space and in the media is everything feels like it's starting from zero, and suddenly we're doing all of these new initiatives like in health, and government's trying to do different things with data and collecting lots of personal data. In actual fact, government holds lots of personal data that it's not making best use of, and we need to communicate that actually there's a baseline level of information that government needs to actually function rather than innovate.
So I agree with that. I think where we are, there's two things. Where we are right now, I think, is that there is a growing awareness about data and the role of data, that we're creating more data, there's more data out there, that people may be doing things with our data. And I think an awareness that data is, driving the digital goods and services that we're all using and is really a key enabler in all our lives. But where I think we need to get to, where I don't think we are right now, is not just an awareness, but a real understanding about what data can mean for people and how better use of data, to use a government term, can really drive not just the private sector organisations' relationship with people, but the public sectors as well. There's huge value in the public sector using data to drive efficiencies, yes, to do more with less, but also to create the public services of the future that we all are going to need and want, based on data and based on kind of insights and knowledge as to how our societies are evolving, and to make data-driven policy decisions and data-driven public service creation and innovation that is data-driven. That is where we need to get to, I think, and we need to tell that story so we can move it from awareness to a real understanding, and then to a buy-in, really, to bring people along on this journey with us. And I agree that we've not done that well enough to date, and the care.data is a good example of that. What I think we need to do, though, is we need to try and find a way of rebalancing the public debate around data. We know that there are concerns, we know that there are privacy, trust and confidence issues, but how do we start talking about and promoting the positive benefits of data use that is making a real difference in people's lives, in communities' lives, in our society's lives? And if we can start to talk more about the good news about data and to try and get some examples, and particularly in the media, if you think about data being talked about in the media, it's normally, unfortunately, if something horrible has happened or data's been lost, and those are terrible situations for everybody. But could we start talking about how data is really making a difference, how data is helping communities, how data is helping the people down your street, or how different regions to thrive and grow? And maybe by rebalancing that debate, we can bring everybody with us on this journey, which I think is going to be key if what we want to do, and particularly from government wants to do with data, is going to be realised.
Yes, addressing the point of effectiveness and whether that is a good parameter for, say, decision in this context where we want to bring everybody on board. Well, effectiveness is not a moral principle or ethical principle, depending on your vocabulary. It's actually, again, with a broad sense of the word, an economic principle. In other words, does it work? Does it work well? Does it actually deliver what it's supposed to deliver? And that could be the ultimate sort of Nazi mechanism in the world. It's very effective. It really does kill all the people that it needs to kill. Fantastic. Do we want it? Probably not. So how do we maneuver that particular engine called effectiveness of, say, policy? Well, that is a matter of safeguards and direction. And what kind of safeguards can we put around that sort of powerful engine? There are at least a couple, and we're acquainted with both of them, just to remind everybody. One has already been mentioned by everyone here, which is trust. You trust an effective way of delivering whatever needs to be delivered when you have three elements in place. It actually does deliver, so it works. You can see that it works, and it's accountable. In other words, if you don't like, and if something goes wrong, someone will pay for something going wrong. The accountability there and the transparency, well, I would like to see much more transparency and accountability at the government level, not only in the corporate world, for all the data that are collected, how the data are being used, who is being tracked, for what reasons, how long for, is there best before, etc. So that's the first guideline, so safeguard. That's trust. The other one is coherence. Even in the worst possible debate at the highest level between my ethics, your ethics, one thing normally everybody agrees on, that you don't contradict yourself. In other words, that you don't adopt policies that in the long run will undermine the values that those policies are supposed to defend and make flourish. So in the case of terrorism, if you transform, say, a nation into a fully monitored, 24/7 kind of 1984 dystopian, and it's very effective, well, the coherence of that is zero. Basically, you made terrorists win the game. They transformed your place in exactly the place they want. So between coherence on the one hand and trust on the other, or these true components, then you can start maneuvering effectiveness in terms of policy in the right direction. But effectiveness by itself, it can actually give you the worst possible results.
Okay, question from down the front, and then I've got one in the middle as well, and then one at the back. And then after those three, I might come back to the panel to ask for some closing remarks.
Hi. Sorry. It's very loud. Rosa Scoble from Brunel University, London. I think on that discussion around public perception around data, in a very simple way, people see data as, evidence to support policy. And now with the demise of the expert that we saw, for example, with the Brexit conversations where there was the same data interpreted in very different ways. I mean, how do we restore this link in policy between, ethical, rigorous data analysis and then how the public sees it used by politicians?
Okay, so we've got the ethical data analysis and how the public use data. Let's take the three questions together. There's one in the middle, and then there's one in the centre at the back.
Hi, excuse me. I'm Jenny Mohan. I'm from the Cabinet Office. And my question, well, I'd like some wild speculation from the panel, please, about where the ideal position of all this is, say, in the turn of the next century. Where will we be with data privacy and everything we've been talking about? Because obviously it's such a new thing, that we're having a very uncomfortable evolution at the moment, I think, and I'd like to know where you'd like it to be 90 years from now.
Okay, there's an ambitious one for you to come to, and then one more.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Dan. There was a discussion earlier from Luciano's talk about human dignity and how we are malleable as humans. How do you draw the line between, how like the Brexit, Trump, the rise of populism, people say that they've been accelerated by targeted information being given to people. Is there an ethical issue there if you target a certain information to people to sway them to that ideal or decision? Because like we said, human dignity, you should have freedom. But then if you're constantly barraged with this information, isn't your freedom somewhat compromised to lead you to think otherwise? If there's an ethical issue there, how can that be regulated as well? Thank you.
We've had previous presentations in this forum where certain high street companies have talked about the way that it's find it quite easy to manipulate us in what we buy and purchase, etc., in a very similar way. So we've got three questions there. One from Rosa on the public perception of how data is used versus the politicians and the way that they use it. We've got Dan's on whether or not this is a good thing that information is being targeted at us when we may not want it, and it could be influencing some of our choices. And then to finish, we've got Jenny's on where will we all be in 90 years' time? I won't be here.
I hope I'm still here in 90 years' time, because obviously I'm only 20. No, that's my first lie of the day.
You need to get quality of data right as well at this point.
Yeah, someone disprove it. Where we'll be in, I'm going to start with that. Where we will be, I think that we will be in a data-driven society and world where technology is more pervasive than it even is today, that we will see artificial intelligence and machine learning coming to a fore. That is still quite new. It's a nascent market. It's still developing, I think, and it's not going to, it's quick, but it's not going to happen overnight. I think in 90 years we'll really see kind of artificial intelligence and machine learning being driven or flowing throughout the fabric of our society. And that will mean that this is a really important time to get some of these discussions and get some of these questions right. Because we are, I think, at a turning point where the way that the debate and the discussion will go around technology is used for, good, because I really think it's a powerful, technology has a really good opportunity to be a real power for good. The way that these evolve will be driven by decisions and discussions that we have now. So what will be in 90 years, I think, is actually determined a lot by us and how we discuss these issues and what we decide how these technologies will evolve. But what I expect to see is a real rise of artificial intelligence, machine learning being really the kind of, I suppose, the www of the future, really. On the politicians' issue, so we've kind of seen this issue being raised a little bit by the ICO at the moment in terms of they've got a consultation out at the moment around data analytics and how that's being used in political campaigning, and I think it'd be interesting to see what comes out of that piece of work and that discussion. But I think it does raise the issue of the debate around data's role in society as a whole, not just in the kind of corporate world, but across the whole. And then the need to understand where we are, to understand how data is being used, but then also to kind of counteract with that with public sentiment as well, and we need to bring that in, and hopefully the ICO's work in that will kind of will be quite insightful, I think, in terms of what they come up with. I'm going to leave it at that now.
Okay. The Royal Society, was it around 90 years ago? It was, wasn't it?
Formed, yeah.
So we have a few hundred years of history, I'm afraid you've put me on the spot naming exactly how many years. But I was going to start by challenging the idea that this is a new thing that we are only just experiencing, because data has a really long history in being used by states and governments, or the census data, and really back to the foundation of the modern state. And the Operational Research Society itself has its roots around the same time as when Alan Turing was asking, can machines think, and really sparking off the fields of machine learning. So these aren't all new issues. We do have a history we can draw from, and that's why we've been working, for example, with the British Academy on our data governance project, because it's really important to bring a cross-disciplinary approach, and including a historical approach to help address these issues. Then moving to the point about data and the public, I was going to pick up in the last question that it was framed in terms of public acceptance. And picking up on some of Luciano's comments about trust, I was going to challenge whether acceptance is really the right word to be using there. Would we not be better off talking about public confidence? Because that leads you to a whole different set of policy remedies, which might be based around dialogue as a mode of engagement, and dialogue about both risks and benefits of different approaches, different pieces of evidence. Then finally, going back to the point about information use, tailoring, and increasing personalisation, I'll trail here that the Royal Society will be doing some work on filter bubbles and technological responses to bursting the bubble over the next few months. But again, there are risks and benefits here. We talked in our public dialogues about use of machine learning in marketing and increased personalisation. And you get both sides of this argument. Some people find it helpful to navigate this world of information overload by having a fairly simple push towards certain types of content. But in other contexts, it becomes less useful. So I just flag that work, and also that regulation is not the only response to these issues. There are, as I say, a much broader suite of governance responses which can draw on both technological developments as well as regulatory instruments.
Okay, so to talk about the kind of restoring the link between people's confidence, as Jess put it, which I think is a very good way of describing it, and sort of how they see politicians and maybe what people are doing in government. Well, firstly, we have to communicate, as I said before, be very clear about what we're doing. Things like the data science ethical framework, I think, are useful for that. I think sometimes data science ethical framework can be a misleading title, but what actually a big part of sort of the first version and the next version will actually be around the kind of the ethics of how you collect, use, store, and eventually delete the data. It's not just about what you do with it in your particular data science project. And I think we think about this a lot on our team, about how we could go about communicating that to the public effectively and with the most value, because we don't want to put even more information in people's faces that they maybe don't want. So there's a big question around that. And the first version of the framework was actually done with a so public dialogue. And again, the kinds of the things we've already discussed here, it's very much context dependent, and people like to, they are data pragmatists, and they just like to know what benefit, what good things you can do with the data. But we also have a responsibility at GDS and other government departments to make sure that ministers understand data, because they may not necessarily be the most data literate people themselves. So part of our responsibility is that when they go out and speak to people, that they actually know what they're talking about. So we need to bridge the gap between us and them, and then them and the public, so that everyone is actually speaking the same language and knows what they're talking about. And hopefully we can help to do that with further iterations of the data science ethical framework. I think in terms of where we're going to be in 90 years' time, I'd like to think that it could be some kind of progression past things like having various personal health apps and things that will help us to be more in control of our own, not just our data, but ourselves, so we can actually learn more and more about ourselves, and we take kind of the pressure of public services to actually make our own decisions about things. And sort of going into the kind of targeted kind of marketing and filter bubble area, I mean, I definitely think there's a massive ethical issue, and I think we're seeing the effects of that already, and I think it's really good that that's now becoming kind of a conversation in the public sphere. Just from a personal aspect, I find it all quite boring to have same things given to me all the time. I don't want that, and maybe some people do. I'm just speaking completely from my own opinion now. I think that would be a very boring world where we're only ever given the same things over and over again. I don't want to be giving adverts for something that I've just bought. I find that annoying and useless. So hopefully we can have more of a conversation about that, and actually think, are these the kinds of things that we really want to be doing? And are we going to get into a very strange place where we all just become parodies of ourselves because we're given the same information constantly?
Okay, difficult question. I'll start with the public perception of data. And I think, apart from joining anyone else in what has been said so far, what I might add to that is that there's an immense responsibility of mass media in essentially forming public opinion. I know we're on record, and I'm going to say something that is not particularly nice, but most people think what you make them think, honestly. And we will start doing real politics and real changes when we realize that there's no such thing as the enlightened, informed citizen. Yeah, maybe 1 million, 1.5 million out of 100. Basically, those are the readers of The Economist. I mean, in the world. That's how much The Economist is read in the world. But then you pick up any other sort of mass media, and it's mostly rubbish. And because it's mostly rubbish, it's mostly disinformation of the public opinion, and therefore the formatting of your average citizen, myself included. So mass media, if there's a public perception of data, that needs to change. It won't be academically in some few ivory towers, in some among intellectual or bright people, all ourselves included here. It will be in the mass media making a different sort of wave in a different direction. Am I optimistic about that? Depends on the financial incentives, as brutal as that. If there is a financial incentive, they will go in a different direction. If there isn't, we will keep having the same kind of misleading culture. On number two, which is linked, of course, to the mass media as well, the nudging, the sort of maneuvering around our personal choices. I think we should be ready to accept that our society should enable and empower as many people as possible, potentially everybody, and be ready for the disappointment that very few will be saved. Because if you run, and I'm getting close to the thought experiment, if you run a thought experiment and you give to every person you know or you ever met on a bus or on the ground £1 million tomorrow, the lottery ticket, the last thing they're going to do is to go to the library, go to an exhibition. The first thing they're going to do is buy a new car or pay the mortgage or go to the restaurant, have a great holiday. And that's us. So we better have the right anthropology there, otherwise we're still talking about an idealized world which is nowhere to be found. So empowering everybody, yes. Giving a chance to everybody, yes. Letting everybody free to spend 90 years of their life in front of a TV watching Netflix, absolutely. That's the world in which I want to live, in which anyone who wants to ruin their life, it's free to do it. As long as I haven't them, with all the opportunities not to do it. So that Calvinist, as in the religious guy, view that very few will be saved. I'm afraid that's going to be part of the future. About the future, 90 years from now, 90, I don't know, but let's say 90. I prefer that to 100. I think in that context, we have really two different questions. One is what is going to happen, and the other one, what should happen. The one that what is going to happen is that we're going to see a world a bit more polarized, where the bright become brighter and the stupid become more stupid, the rich richer and the poor poorer. So I think there will be a little bit more of that, more likely. There will be more sectorial fragmentation of society. We will speak less to each other. We will understand each other a little bit less. Now the bubbles will be increasing. We will be more unable to even fathom what the neighbor really is saying when he's voting for that party, or 11 million French voting for a fascist sort of party. Like, really? Do you remember Vichy? I mean, it's in living memory. No, there are people out there who actually were there when it was happening. And yet, that is history repeating itself. So I don't have a particularly optimistic view about how the world is moving. However, that's the philosopher, the ultimate Pollyanna. There is something we could do. There is a future that we should work for. And that's a world in which essentially our digital capitalism is no longer consumeristic. We can unglue the best engine we ever created to generate wealth on this planet, which is capitalism, from consuming to death the planet itself. And how do you replace that? Well, you remove consumerism, you put in a way of taking care of the world as opposed to eating it alive, so not consuming but fostering the world, and all of a sudden, well, that picture becomes way brighter. There are no divisions, we take care of each other, jobs will be in the caring industry, there will be more green jobs than any other blue or white or brown colors, and it's a world that we could grab. It is within our power. Having said that, 4 days a week, I'm optimistic, the other 3 days, not so much.
Okay, we're very short of time, so rather than a long recap from many of the panels, you've got 45, 46 influential analysts in the room. What would be your ask of them in this space? What do you think they should go out and do from now on?
Analysts?
The analysts. These are your people to actually bring about change.
These are our people.
I would ask of the analysts to engage with things like the Data Science Ethical Framework. And obviously, I think there's a job for us to do to be more proactive than that. I think if we can start conversations with analysts who are practical, intelligent people in government, we can have some really good conversations about how at least we can do things that are useful and sensible in government. So I would definitely make that a call for anyone to get in touch who wants to help work on the Data Science Ethical Framework.
Thank you, Sarah.
So very similar, I would argue or suggest that you try and talk to as many people as possible, and in this debate, how we will be successful going forward is by everybody working together. So as I said, this is not something, and these issues, not something we're going to solve today. There's no silver bullet. We need to all work together. So it's not something the government can do on its own. It's not something I think you guys could do on your own. We could do on our own, or even society. And let's not forget individuals and citizens can do on their own. We need to be working together. So let's work together.
Thank you, Sue. Luciano?
All of the above. And if you're not doing it already, there's no think. Just think a lot. Stay on the problems. Don't rush for solutions. That's what I remind myself and my students all the time. Love to stay on the problem. If you stay on the problem long enough, you will know your enemy, you will find a solution. Rush to a solution and the problem will have the upper hand. So think.
Thank you. Jessica?
So at the risk of violent agreement across all panellists, I'd just say get involved in the conversation. And this is across the technical domains as well as with the public and with policymakers as well.
Okay, thank you. We've overrun slightly. It's going to be impossible to try and pull together what was a very rich, interesting and quite inspiring discussion actually in a number of areas. A couple of things that came out of it. We have the power to set the direction. We can learn from the people that we've heard from today, but there's an awful lot that we can do there. There is a somewhat distracting debate about data ownership and what are the right ethics in this, But I think just building on Luciano's last point there, but he also raised earlier, if we're thinking about the purpose and the problem and thinking about why we're trying to do something and what the good aspect of that is, I think that can help us. There are clearly tools out there in terms of the General Data Protection Regulation and the Data Science Ethical Framework, both of which have been referred to a couple of times. I'm now enlightened there are 2 documents, 2 pieces of work that I need to be more familiar with, so that will be good. But there's also something in that public perception bit. We've all got a responsibility for how we actually tell the story, because there's something there about being a bit more transparent and getting that information out there, debunking some of those myths that come out through the false truths that we hear so much on the news. And then just for me as well, I like the analogy. I was thinking back on, before I said that one, 1927, the world was very different. We could not have foreseen where we would be now 90 years ago, and I think it's actually a very difficult question to think about where we'll be. It will just be very different, and most of the concepts that we'll be aware of, even in the next 20 or 30 years, given the pace of change that we've actually seen, are going to be radically and fundamentally different for the way that we operate in society. And I'll leave you with my favourite comment so far, that we all have responsibility to keep the park clean. So, thank you very much for our panellists today.